The second my divorce was finalized, I canceled my ex-mother-in-law's platinum card. She'd been spending my money for 5 years. 12 hours later, they were at my door and I had a folder that ended everything. The card declined at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was sitting at my kitchen counter with an espresso and my laptop, watching the confirmation email from my bank load in real time. Authorization removed. Card ending 4471. Effective immediately. When my phone rang. Not buzzed. Rang. The full, insistent ring of someone who had tried to text first and wasn't getting the response they wanted. Anthony. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. What the hell did you do, Marissa? Not hello. Not even the performance of hello. 5 years of marriage dissolved by a judge at 11:43 that morning, and the first words out of his mouth were an accusation delivered at a volume that suggested he was either in a car or had genuinely forgotten how indoor voices work. I sipped my espresso. Good afternoon, Anthony. Don't a breath. The deliberate breath of a man trying to deploy composure as a tactic. Mother's card was just declined. At Bergdorf. In front of, there were people there. Marissa. People who know her. I'm sure it was very dramatic, I said. They treated her like a shoplifter. I almost laughed. I held it in, not out of mercy, but because laughing would have given him something to respond to, and I wasn't interested in giving him anything to respond to anymore. She wasn't treated like a shoplifter, Anthony. She was reminded that when the plastic isn't in your name, you don't get to swipe it. Don't be petty. Call the bank and authorize the transaction. Whatever she bought, just no. The word landed the way I'd practiced landing it in my head for approximately 3 years. Petty, I said. That's an interesting word. I've been thinking about petty. Is it petty to spend 5 years funding your mother's Italian leather handbag collection? Is it petty to cover her dental reconstruction while she told my colleagues at our dinner parties that my business suits were too masculine? Or is petty what happens when the person who's been paying for everything finally stops? Silence. Eleanor is your financial responsibility now, I said. If she needs luxury goods from Fifth Avenue, I genuinely encourage you to figure out how to provide them. She will never touch another dollar I earn. Not one. I hung up. Then I blocked his cell, his office line, the number I recognized as his sister's, which he sometimes used when he thought I wouldn't pick up for him, the number for his mother's Connecticut house, which I had memorized involuntarily over 5 years of being called from it at inconvenient hours about problems that were always somehow my financial responsibility to solve. The silence in my apartment after all of that was the most expensive thing I'd ever owned. I finished my espresso. I opened the good wine. Let me tell you who I was before I tell you what they turned me into and what I turned myself back into on the other side, because the arc matters and I'm not interested in telling the short version anymore. My name is Marissa Voss. I am 39 years old. I built Apex Ascendancy from a single laptop on a particle board desk in a studio apartment in Murray Hill into a digital marketing firm that, by the year my marriage ended, was managing accounts for 11 Fortune 500 companies and generating $14 million in annual revenue. I did this by working hours that would have alarmed a cardiologist, surviving on espresso, and the specific, ruthless focus of someone who understands that attention is the only real currency, and she needs to spend hers correctly. I was not born into money. I was born into a family in Cincinnati that understood money as something that left faster than it arrived, and I had decided at 19 that this would not be the permanent condition of my life, and I had been correct, and it had cost me approximately everything I had that wasn't professional. I met Anthony Whitford at a charity gala in 2018, the kind of event I attended because clients expected it, and not because I enjoyed standing in rooms where the food was decorative and the conversations were performances. He was charming. He was handsome in the specific way of men who have been told they are handsome their whole lives and have organized a significant portion of their personality around the information. He laughed at my jokes before I finished them, which I found attractive and which I later understood was a technique rather than a response. His mother, Eleanor Whitford, was at the same gala. She shook my hand with 2 fingers. I told myself it was nerves, an old-fashioned gesture, something that would soften as she got to know me. Eleanor did not soften. Eleanor was not a woman who softened. Eleanor was a woman who had been beautiful at 23 and had converted that beauty into a social position she intended to maintain indefinitely, financed by whoever was currently closest to her and willing to be managed. For 5 years, that was me. Anthony and I married in 2019. Small ceremony because I was building a company and didn't have time for the production Eleanor wanted, which was the first battle I won and the last one for a while. After the wedding, the financial architecture of our life together assembled itself with a specific inevitability of things that happened gradually and then all at once. My income, which by 2020 had grown to a level that made Anthony's consulting work feel supplementary rather than contributory, became the household's operating budget, the emergency fund, the vacation fund, the gift fund, and, without any formal discussion I could point to, the Eleanor Whitford Maintenance Fund. The list was staggering, and I have a document that proves it because I am a woman who keeps documents. Eleanor's dental reconstruction, $28,000. Not medically necessary dental work. The full cosmetic overhaul she'd been planning since her second husband left and she'd decided her teeth were responsible. Anthony's sister, Cecilia's private school tuition, 2 years, $61,000, with the understanding that Cecilia's father would eventually reimburse me, an understanding that was never converted into anything resembling a legal commitment and was not honored. A roof replacement on Eleanor's Connecticut house, which I found out about when a contractor called my cell phone, not Anthony's, to confirm the payment schedule. 3 vehicle leases. 2 family vacations to Aspen, where I covered the flights, the house rental, the ski rentals, the dinners, and the incidentals, while Cecilia Julia told me over fondue that a proper woman wouldn't be so obsessed with chasing dollars, and Eleanor laughed into her wine. None of them had a single problem with the dollars once they were chasing them back to Connecticut. The total, which my forensic accountant Diane Mercer, 21 years in financial reconstruction, the kind of woman who treats a spreadsheet like a crime scene, compiled for me over the 6 months preceding my divorce filing, was $142,000. That was what I'd spent on the Whitford family outside of the normal household expenses Anthony and I shared. $142,000 for 5 years of being called furniture. The $85,000 was something else entirely. That came later. I need to explain when I started knowing, because there is a difference between knowing and being willing to look at what you know, and I spent longer in that gap than I am proud of. The first sign was in 2021. Apex had a client, a mid-size e-commerce company called Fenwick Retail that had been with us for 18 months and represented about $400,000 in annual billings. The relationship was managed through my VP of Client Services, Jordan Park, who was methodical and careful and had never once given me a reason to question his account notes. In March, Jordan flagged an anomaly in the Fenwick account, a vendor payment that had gone through our internal billing system that he couldn't match to any contracted service. $12,500, processed from an authorization level above Jordan's but below mine. There was one level between them. Anthony had been brought on as Apex's Director of Strategic Partnerships 18 months earlier. His role was relationship management, introductions, networking, the social infrastructure of business development that I was too busy running the company to cultivate myself. I had given him the access level appropriate for that function. Vendor payment authorization was not supposed to be in that access level. I pulled the authorization logs, his credentials. I told myself it was an error, a systems glitch, something that happened when access permissions were last updated and someone had accidentally expanded his authorization without meaning to. I told myself this because it was March, and we were in the middle of a major campaign launch, and I didn't have the bandwidth for what the alternative meant. I flagged it internally, adjusted the permissions, and moved on. I told myself I'd look at it more carefully after the launch. The second sign was 6 months later. Diane Mercer, who I'd hired for what I'd described to Anthony as an annual financial review, true, technically, in the sense that I did have those annually, but not the specific reason I'd called her this particular year, told me during our September meeting that she was seeing payment patterns in 2 of our vendor accounts that were inconsistent with contracted service schedules. What kind of inconsistent? I said. The payments are going out on time, she said. It's the receiving accounts that have moved. Not dramatically, and they're still going to vendors we have contracts with, but the intermediary routing has changed on both. She laid the bank statements in front of me. I looked at the routing numbers. I looked at the dates the routing had changed. I looked at the authorization logs she'd pulled. My hands were in my lap under the conference table, and I pressed them flat against my thighs, and I breathed through my nose, and I said, "How long has this been happening?" "Based on what I can see," she said carefully, "approximately 14 months. 14 months. Anthony had been at the company for 18. I drove home that evening in the specific mechanical way you drive, when your conscious mind is doing something else entirely. Hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, the functional portion of your brain managing the physical task, while the rest of you sits with information it has not yet finished processing. I did not say anything to Anthony. I called my attorney instead. Her name was Claire Nakamura. She had been my corporate attorney since the company's second year, and she had the specific quality of someone who has spent 23 years in business and family law, watching people make decisions under emotional pressure, and has developed a complete and efficient system for getting them to make better ones. When I called her on a Thursday evening and explained what Diane had found, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't touch anything. Don't move any accounts. Don't change any access levels. Don't say anything to Anthony. We need a forensic audit before anything else happens." "How long?" 6 to 8 weeks for a full picture. Faster if it's as clean as it sounds. "And after?" A pause. "After, you'll have decisions to make. Let's get the information first." The information took 7 weeks. James Okafor, Diane's forensic accounting colleague, 26 years in financial fraud investigation, a man who spoke about numbers with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows they will eventually tell him everything he needs, spent those 7 weeks doing what he described as following the water. "Money moves like water," he said in the conference room at Claire's office on a gray November morning. "It always finds the lowest point. The question is what's below the surface that you can't see yet." What was below the surface was $85,000, moved in 17 transactions over 14 months through the vendor routing anomalies Diane had identified into an account that was, James placed the document in front of me and let me read it without editorializing, in Anthony's name, not a business account, a personal account at a bank I had never heard of, in a city I had never been to with him. "Tampa," I said. "The account was opened 14 months ago," James said, approximately 3 weeks after he started at Apex. I sat with that. "The account has regular withdrawals," he said. "Dining, hotels, 2 flights, a deposit to a property I flagged." He slid another page across the table. "A lease agreement, Tampa, Florida, 1 bedroom, 12-month term, beginning 14 months ago." Anthony had been going to Tampa for client development trips twice a quarter. I had stopped processing new information by that point and had moved into the specific stillness of a person who has received enough and needs a moment before they can receive more. Claire was watching me carefully. She had been a divorce attorney for 11 of her 23 years before moving primarily to corporate work, and she had a therapist's awareness of when someone needed a moment versus when they needed a question. She gave me the moment. Then she said, "Marissa, what do you want to do?" I looked at the lease agreement. I looked at the routing numbers. I thought about Eleanor's dental reconstruction. Everything, I said. I want to do everything correctly, and I want every piece of it documented, and I want to make exactly one move at exactly the right time. Claire nodded slowly. Then let's start preparing. The preparation took 4 months. I want to be honest about what those 4 months were like, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer about them. I went home every night to an apartment I shared with a man who had been stealing from my company and conducting a parallel life in Tampa, and I made dinner and responded to his conversation and slept in the same bed and performed the ongoing production of a marriage that I was methodically, carefully, legally dismantling in parallel. I started therapy in December. Dr. Patricia Sung, 15 years in trauma-informed practice, the kind of therapist who asks the question underneath the question you're trying to answer. She was the first person I told everything to. The money, the company, the Tampa apartment, Eleanor, the 5 years of being called furniture while funding the furniture. You've been operating under extraordinary stress for a long time, she said in our 3rd session. Yes, I said, and you've been managing it by continuing to perform normalcy. It's more efficient than the alternative. She looked at me carefully. At some point, Marissa, efficiency stops being a strategy and starts being a defense mechanism. I thought about that for a long time. I know, I said. I just need to get through the next 4 months. She helped me get through them. I filed for divorce in February. Not announced. Filed. Claire submitted the petition on a Tuesday morning while Anthony was at a breakfast meeting with a client I had introduced him to, which was the kind of detail that was both specific and pointless, and that I had stopped trying to manage my feelings about. The petition included a motion for immediate separation of all jointly held financial accounts, which was granted the same day on the basis of the forensic documentation Claire presented. Anthony's access to any Apex systems was revoked simultaneously, quietly, by my IT director Marcus Chen, who had worked for me for 6 years and who, when I explained the situation in the minimum necessary terms, had said simply, "Tell me when and I'll have it done in 4 minutes." It took 3 minutes. Anthony found out he'd been locked out of the company systems when he got back from breakfast and tried to pull a report. He found out about the divorce filing when Claire's office served him the papers at 2 p.m. He called me 7 times between 2:15 and 4 South. I was in a client meeting and did not answer any of them. By the time I emerged, Claire had fielded a call from his attorney, a man named Jeffrey Aldrich, who apparently practiced family law on the Upper East Side, and had the voice, Claire reported, of someone who had just been handed a case that was significantly more complicated than his client had indicated. He's going to want to negotiate, Claire said. Let him want, I said. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Anthony's attorney made 3 attempts to characterize the company funds as marital assets subject to division, which Claire dismantled with James's forensic documentation each time. Apex had been founded before the marriage, capitalized entirely by my premarital savings, and the $85,000 was not a marital contribution. It was a theft, and the paper trail said so. At some point during week 4, Jeffrey Aldrich stopped trying to negotiate and started trying to make the $85,000 go away. This told me that he'd finally managed to get the full picture out of Anthony, and that the full picture was worse than what Anthony had told him initially. We reached a settlement that I am not going to describe in detail, because some numbers stay private and because the specific terms matter less than what they represented. Apex was entirely mine, which it had always been, and Anthony left the marriage with what he'd arrived in it with, which was considerably less. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday at 11:43 a.m. By 2:14 p.m., Eleanor's card was canceled. I cooked that night. The Wagyu ribeye I'd been saving for an occasion. The vintage Amarone that Anthony had been trying to open for his business associates for 2 years. Every time he'd reached for it, I'd redirected with something else from the rack. Not because I was planning anything, just because some things should be drunk by people who notice what they're drinking. I noticed. I ate alone at the window of my apartment, 23 floors above the city grid, with the lights doing what New York lights do at 10 on a Tuesday, glittering and indifferent and beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful when you've stopped needing them to mean something and can just let them be what they are. The silence was the most expensive thing I'd ever tasted. I went to bed at midnight. At 6:42 in the morning, my front door nearly came off its hinges. Boom. The kind of knock that isn't a knock. That's a fist, multiple times, with the specific energy of someone who has been building up to it in a car or an elevator and is delivering the accumulated pressure of that journey directly to the wood. I was awake. I had been awake for 7 minutes, in the specific pre-coffee clarity that is actually sometimes clearer than the post-coffee version because nothing has happened yet to make it complicated. I walked to the people without rushing. I want to be clear about that. I walked to the people the way I walked to everything that morning, without rushing, because I had spent 4 months preparing for the moment when they would understand what had happened. And preparation is what you do instead of panic. Eleanor, face the color of a stop sign, her mess scarf tied with the specific precision of a woman who had taken time with her appearance before coming to pound on my door, which told me something about how she understood this confrontation as a performance for which she needed to be appropriately costumed. Her eyes, behind the scarf and the blowout and the fury, were feral in the specific way of someone who has never in 67 years been denied something she believed was hers. Anthony behind her, briefcase in hand, using his mother as a human shield, which was the most honest thing I'd seen him do in years. Down the hall, the door to apartment 14C opened 3 inches. Mr. Henderson, retired family court judge, 22 years on the bench, current co-op board president, a man who had a complete and efficient understanding of what was and wasn't appropriate conduct in a residential building. He did not say anything. He simply opened his door and left it open, which was itself a statement. I put the security chain on, opened my door 3 3 inches. "Good morning, Eleanor," I said. "And Anthony. What an unpleasant surprise. How absolutely dare you?" Her voice came through the gap in the specific register of someone who is both furious and performing furious for maximum effect. "Do you have any conception of what you've done to my social standing? I was at Bergdorf with Constance Merritt and Diana Alcott. They watched that card decline. They watched." I understood what she was saying. In Eleanor's world, the world I had been funding for 5 years, social standing was not a metaphor. It was the architecture of everything. The card declining in front of Constance Merritt was not an inconvenience. It was a public demotion, and public demotion in that world had consequences she considered catastrophic. This was accurate and not my problem. "Anthony," I looked past Eleanor at my ex-husband, who was doing the thing he did in confrontations, staying slightly behind the primary combatant and waiting to see how the terrain settled before committing to a position. "What brings you to my building?" He deployed the negotiation voice, the one that was soft and calculated and had worked on me so many times in the early years that I had eventually studied it the way you study a mechanism, to understand how it operated and stop being operated by it. "Marissa, please. Come on, let us inside. Let's resolve this banking glitch like rational adults." "Banking glitch?" "No," I said. "One word. The vault door word." He flinched. "This apartment is solely my property," I said. "My name on the deed. Purchased before our marriage. Awarded to me outright in the settlement you signed on Friday. Neither of you will ever cross this threshold again." Eleanor shoved Anthony aside and pressed her face into the gap, and the smell of her perfume, something French and expensive that I had smelled for 5 years and that would, I suspected, forever carry this specific association, filled the 3 inches between us. "You are going to unfreeze my card this instant," she said. "You owe this family. 5 years I tolerated your aggressive career obsession, your inappropriate dinner conversation, your complete inability to dress like a woman rather than a managing director. You owe us." I looked at her. I had spent 5 years managing my response to Eleanor, editing, softening, finding the diplomatic language that preserved the surface of a relationship I was paying for. I had been very good at it. I had been so good at it that I think, looking back, she had genuinely come to believe I had no response, that the edited version was the only version, that beneath the professional composure was more professional composure all the way down. She was about to find out otherwise. "According to my accounting department, Eleanor," I said, and I made sure my voice carried clearly, because Mr. Henderson's door was still open, and I was aware of that, and I was not going to pretend I wasn't. "It is actually you who owe me $142,000. Roof replacement on your Connecticut property. 2 cosmetic procedures you told Anthony were emergency medical expenses. 3 vehicle leases in your name running through our household account. And the private school tuition for Cecilia that her father was going to pay back and didn't, which is its own kind of interesting because your son was apparently very supportive of that plan while simultaneously moving money out of my company, but we'll get to that." Eleanor's face went white, not pale. "White. She's lying," she said, but she said it to Anthony, which meant it wasn't really a statement. It was a question wearing a statement's clothes. "Tell her she's insane, Anthony. Tell her." Anthony was looking at the floor. "The most interesting discovery," I continued, "wasn't your mother's spending." I reached to the console table behind me. I had placed it there last night after dinner when I was deciding how this morning would go, and picked up the black leather folder Claire's office had compiled. Not the full forensic file. The executive summary, clean, specific, $85,000, 17 transactions, 14 months, Tampa. It was the $85,000 your son embezzled from my company to finance a life I wasn't aware he was living. The word embezzled landed in the hallway like something physical. Eleanor turned to Anthony with an expression I had never seen on her face in 5 years, not the fury she brought to me. Something older and more personal. The specific betrayal of a woman who has spent her entire adult life managing her social position and has just understood that the person standing behind her has been quietly destroying the financial basis of it. "Anthony." Her voice had lost every molecule of venom. It was just a word now, just his name. "What is she talking about?" Anthony looked at the carpet. His silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in a hallway. I held the folder up so he could see the cover. His name on the first tab, the account in Tampa, the routing numbers, the lease. "My attorneys are very enthusiastic about sharing this with the district attorney," I said. "James Okafor, the forensic accountant who compiled it, has 26 years of experience in financial fraud investigation. He describes the documentation as unusually clean." I took that as a compliment to my record keeping. I closed the folder. I closed the door. The deadbolt went in with the click of something that had been moving toward its locked position for 4 months and had finally arrived. Through the wood, in the hallway of my building, I heard Eleanor Whitford turn on her son. I heard her find the volume she'd been saving for me and redirect it somewhere it had always arguably belonged. I walked back to my kitchen. I made espresso. I sat at the counter with my laptop and my coffee and the morning light coming in off the city, and I opened my email, and I had 17 messages from clients and 4 from my team and 1 from Claire that said simply, "DA's office confirmed 9 a.m. Thursday. Bring the folder." I would bring the folder. I had been building the folder for 7 weeks with some of the most precise professionals I had ever worked with, and it was, as James Okafor had described, unusually clean. The DA's office would find it so. The process would take time. These things always took time, but the paper trail existed, and paper trails did not disappear because the person on the wrong end of them found them inconvenient. Anthony would have decisions to make about Tampa, about Jeffrey Aldrich, who was going to be surprised, about his mother, who was currently in my hallway discovering that the infrastructure she had built her social life on had not belonged to her family. It had belonged belonged to me, and I had simply stopped lending it. Detective Rosa Martinez from the Manhattan DA's Financial Crimes Unit reviewed James's documentation on Thursday morning. She was 44 years old, 17 years in white-collar crime investigation, and she had the specific economy of motion of someone who has learned to be thorough without being theatrical. She read the summary while I sat across from her and did not perform patience. She looked up after 7 minutes. "This is well organized," she said. "I have a good team," I said. "The routing documentation is clear. The account in Tampa is clearly personal, not business. The authorization level he had. You said that shouldn't have allowed vendor payment processing. I've had IT pull the access log going back to his first week," I said. "He modified his own permissions 3 weeks after he started. I should have caught it earlier." She made a note. "That's actually helpful. It demonstrates intent." Claire, sitting beside me, did not say anything. She didn't need to. She had been saying things on my behalf for 4 months and had said them all correctly, and now the information was in the right room with the right person, which was all that was required. The investigation was opened on a Friday. Anthony was contacted the following Tuesday. Jeffrey Aldrich called Claire on Wednesday to discuss resolution options, which Claire described to me over the phone with the specific neutral tone she used when something was going exactly as expected and she didn't want to editorialize. "What kind of options?" I said. "Full restitution, cooperation, and a negotiated plea," she said. "The DA has agreed to consider it. What do you think?" "I think you get the money back and the record exists and you don't spend 2 years in a trial," she said. "I think that's actually the better outcome." I thought about it. "Done," I said. The restitution came in full, which I did not expect, which meant Anthony had resources he had not disclosed during the divorce proceedings, which was its own category of information that Claire noted with what I could only describe as professional interest, and which resulted in a supplemental motion that I will not detail, but that was resolved in a way that Claire described as satisfactory. "Eleanor, I learned through the specific social osmosis of New York, the way information travels through certain circles without requiring a direct source, sold the Connecticut house in the spring, not by choice. The roof replacement I'd funded had, it turned out, been the most recent in a series of deferred maintenance costs that had accumulated while I'd been paying the bills she forwarded and not examining the underlying property condition. Without my money and without Anthony's embezzled supplement, the carrying costs were not manageable. She moved to Florida, not Tampa. The card with the Bergdorf-Goodman incident became, I heard from a former mutual acquaintance, with the delighted tone of someone delivering perfect gossip, something of a story in certain circles. The story, as it circulated, was about Eleanor, but the version I heard was actually about me, about the woman who'd been called too aggressive and too obsessed with dollars, who had apparently spent 5 years keeping score while appearing not to. I did not correct the story. I did not need the story. I had the spreadsheet. Dr. Sung asked me in our session the week after the DA meeting what I was going to do with the time I used to spend managing everything. "Work," I said, "but differently." "How differently?" I thought about it. "I spent 5 years building something extraordinary and simultaneously funding a situation that was actively draining it. I'd like to try the first part without the second part and see what's possible." She looked at me. "How does that feel?" "Efficient," I said. She smiled just slightly. "Is efficiency still a defense mechanism?" she said. "Or are you actually okay?" I considered the question honestly, the way she had been teaching me to consider questions, not the first answer, which is usually the performed one, but the one underneath it. "Both," I said. "But the ratio is improving."